The monarchy of Sweden concerns the monarchical head of state of Sweden, which is a constitutional and hereditary monarchy with a parliamentary system. The Kingdom of Sweden has been a monarchy since time immemorial. Originally an elective monarchy, it became an hereditary monarchy in the 16th century during the reign of Gustav Vasa, though virtually all monarchs before that belonged to a limited and small amount of families which are considered the royal dynasties of Sweden. Sweden in the present day is a representative democracy in a parliamentary system based on popular sovereignty, as defined in the current instrument of government. The monarch and the members of the royal family undertake a variety of official, unofficial and other representational duties within Sweden and abroad. Carl XVI Gustaf became king on 15 September 1973 on the death of his grandfather Gustav Vasa. History. Pre-16th century Sweden has been a kingdom since prehistoric times. As early as the 1st century, Tacitus wrote that the Swedes had a king, but the order of succession up until King Erik the Victorious is known almost exclusively through accounts in historically controversial Norse sagas. Originally, the Swedish king had combined powers limited to that of a war chief, a judge and a priest at the temple at Uppsala. However, there are thousands of runestones commemorating commoners but no known chronicle about the Swedish kings prior to the 14th century, and there is a relatively small amount of runestones that are thought mention kings, Gs 11, U11 and U861. About 1000 A.D., the first king known to rule both Svealand and Götaland was Olaf Skotkonung, but further history for the next 2 centuries is obscure, with many kings whose tenures and actual influence power is unclear. The royal court of Sweden, however, does count Olaf's father as Sweden's first king. The power of the king was greatly strengthened by the introduction of Christianity during the 11th century, and the following centuries saw a process of consolidation of power in the hands of the king. The king was traditionally elected from a favored dynasty at the Stones of Mora, and the people had the right to elect the king as well as depose him. The ceremonial stones were destroyed around 1515. In the 12th century, the consolidation of Sweden was still affected by dynastic struggles between the Erik and Sverker clans, which ended when a third clan married into the Erik clan and the House of Bjälbo was established on the throne. That dynasty formed a pre-Kalmar union Sweden into a strong state, and finally King Magnus IV even ruled Norway and Scania. Following the Black Death, the union was weakened, and Scania was reunited with Denmark. In 1397, after the Black Death and domestic power struggles, Queen Margaret I of Denmark united Sweden, Denmark and Norway in the Union of Kalmar with the approval of the Swedish nobility. Continual tension within each country and the union led to open conflict between the Swedes and the Danes in the 15th century. The union's final disintegration in the early 16th century led to prolonged rivalry between Denmark, Norway and Sweden for centuries to come. 16th and 17th century changes. Catholic bishops had supported the King of Denmark, Christian II, but he was overthrown in a rebellion led by nobleman Gustav Vasa, whose father had been executed at the Stockholm bloodbath. Gustav Vasa was elected King of Sweden by the Estates of the Realm, assembled in Strängnäs on 6 June 1523. Inspired by the teachings of Martin Luther, Gustav I used the Protestant Reformation to curb the power of the Roman Catholic Church. In 1527 he persuaded the Estates of the Realm, assembled in the city of Västerås, to confiscate church lands, which comprised 21% of the country's farmland. At the same time, he broke with the papacy and established a reformed state church, the Church of Sweden. Throughout his reign, Gustav I suppressed both aristocratic and peasant opposition to his ecclesiastical policies and efforts at centralization, which to some extent laid the foundation for the modern Swedish unitary state. Legally, Sweden has only been a hereditary monarchy since 1544, when the Riksdag of the Estates, through Styrelseordförordning, designated the sons of King Gustav I as the heirs to the throne. Tax reforms took place in 1538 and 1558, whereby multiple complex taxes on independent farmers were simplified and standardized throughout the district, and tax assessments per farm were adjusted to reflect ability to pay. Crown tax revenues increased, but more importantly, the new system was perceived as fairer. A war with Lübeck in 1535 resulted in the expulsion of the Hanseatic traders, who previously had a monopoly on foreign trade. With its own burghers in charge, Sweden's economic strength grew rapidly, and by 1544 Gustav controlled 60% of the farmlands in all of Sweden. Sweden now built the first modern army in Europe, supported by a sophisticated tax system and an efficient bureaucracy. At the death of King Gustav I in 1560, he was succeeded by his eldest son Erik XIV. His reign was marked by Sweden's entrance into the Livonian War and the Northern 7 Years' War, and combined effects of Erik's developing mental disorder and his opposition to the aristocracy, leading to the Stjärn murders in 1567 and the imprisonment of his brother John, who was married to Catherine Jagiellon, sister of King Sigismund II of Poland. In 1568 he was dethroned and succeeded by John III. In domestic politics, John III showed clear Catholic sympathies, inspired by his queen, creating friction with the Swedish clergy and nobility. He reintroduced several Catholic traditions previously abolished, and his foreign policy was affected by his family connection to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where his eldest son had been made King Sigismund III in 1587. Following the death of his father, Sigismund tried to rule Sweden from Poland, leaving Sweden under the control of a regent, his paternal uncle Charles, but was unable to defend his Swedish throne against the ambitions of his uncle. In 1598, Sigismund and his Swedish-Polish army was defeated at the Battle of Stangebro by the forces of Charles, and he was declared deposed by the Estates in 1599. In 1604, the Estates finally recognized the regent and de facto ruler as King Charles IX. His short reign was one of uninterrupted warfare. The hostility of Poland and the breakup of Russia involved him in overseas contests for the possession of Livonia and Ingria, the Polish-Swedish War and the Ingrian War, while his pretensions to claim Lapland brought on a war with Denmark in the last year of his reign. Gustavus Adolphus inherited 3 wars from his father when he ascended to the throne. From 1612, when Count Axel Oxenstierna was appointed Lord High Chancellor, which he remained until Gustavus Adolphus's death, the two men struck a long and successful partnership and complemented each other well. In Oxenstierna's own words, his school balanced the king's heat. The war against Russia ended in 1617 with the Treaty of Stolbova, which excluded Russia from the Baltic Sea. The final inherited war, the war against Poland, ended in 1629 with the Truce of Altmark, which transferred the large province of Livonia to Sweden and freed the Swedish forces for subsequent intervention in the 30 Years' War in Germany, where Swedish forces had already established a bridgehead in 1628. Brandenburg was torn apart by a quarrel between the Protestants and the Catholics. When Gustavus Adolphus began his push into northern Germany in June to July 1630, he had just 4,000 troops, but he was soon able to consolidate the Protestant position in the north, using reinforcements from Sweden and money supplied by France at the Treaty of Stolbova. Gustavus Adolphus was killed at the 1632 Battle of Lutzen. Queen Maria Eleonora and the king's ministers took over the government of the realm on behalf of Gustavus Adolphus's underage daughter Christina, until she reached the age of majority. Gustavus Adolphus is often regarded by military historians as one of the greatest military commanders of all time, with innovative use of combined arms. As the heiress presumptive, at the age of 6, Christina succeeded her father on the Swedish throne, although a Regency government would rule in her name until she turned 18 years of age. During the Regency, Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna wrote the 1634 Instrument of Government, which, although never approved by any money, nevertheless would continue to have an important normative role in the state administration. Christina early on showed an interest in literature and the sciences and famously brought René Descartes to Sweden. Sweden continued to be involved in the 30 Years' War during reign of Christina, and that conflict was settled at the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, and the Swedish monarch received representation at the imperial diet due to the German conquests that were made. After having decided not to get married, Christina abdicated the throne on the 5th of June 1654, in favor of her cousin Charles Gustav, went abroad and converted to Roman Catholicism. The Estates elected Charles X Gustav as the new king, and his short reign is best characterized by foreign wars. First a lengthy campaign within Poland and then with Denmark. In the latter case, the risky 1658 march across the belts, which resulted in the Treaty of Roskilde, would prove to be the largest permanent territorial gain Sweden ever had. Skåne, Blekinge and Bohuslän now became Swedish provinces and have remained so ever since. Charles X Gustav was not satisfied, as he wanted to crush Denmark once and for all. But the 1659 assault on Copenhagen did not prove successful for the Swedes, much of it due to the Dutch naval intervention to the aid of the Danes. Charles X Gustav died in Gothenburg in 1660, and as the crown passed to his 5-year-old son Charles XI, a new regency government would assume the responsibilities of the state. The regency government, composed of aristocrats and led by Chancellor Count Magnus Gabriel de Legardi, was more interested in feathering their own nests rather than to work in the interest of the country at large. When Charles XI came of age in 1672, the effectiveness of the armed forces had seriously deteriorated and the country was ill-prepared as the King of Denmark, Christian V, invaded to settle old scores. The Danes were ultimately unsuccessful in their attempts, and Charles XI would undertake several measures to prevent what had just almost happened from occurring again, reducing the influence of the aristocracy by nationalizing estates and properties which had been handed out to them by his predecessors, introducing the allotment system which would form the basis of the armed forces until the 20th century, and with the support of the estates he was declared in 1680 an absolute monarch. Charles XI was succeeded by his son, Charles XII, who would prove to be an extremely able military commander, defeating far larger enemies with the small but highly professional Swedish army. His defeat of the Russians at Narva when just 18 years old was to be his greatest victory. However, his campaigning at the head of his army during the Great Northern War would ultimately lead to catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Poltava, after which he spent several years in Turkey. Some years later he was killed at the Siege of Fredriksson during an attempt to invade Norway. The Swedish Age of Greatness had ended. 18th century to the present. Charles XII's sister, Ulrika Eleonora, had now inherited the throne, but she was forced by the estates to sign the 1719 Instrument of Government, which ended the absolute monarchy and made the Riksdag of the estates the highest organ of the state and reduced the role of monarch to a figurehead. The Age of Liberty, with its parliamentary rule, dominated by two parties, the caps and the hats, had begun. Ulrika Eleonora had had enough after a year on the throne and abdicated in favor of her husband, Frederick, who had little interest in the affairs of state and was elected king by the estates as King Frederick I, resulting in the 1720 Instrument of Government, content-wise almost identical to the one from 1719. Despite having many extramarital affairs, Frederick I never sired a legitimate heir to the throne. The 1720 Instrument in Government was later replaced by the 1772 Instrument of Government in a self-coup orchestrated by King Gustav III. On the 17th of September 1809 in the Treaty of Frederikshamn, as a result of the poorly managed Finnish War, Sweden had to surrender the eastern half of Sweden to Russia. King Gustav IV Adolphus and his descendants were deposed in a coup d'état led by dissatisfied army officers. The childless uncle of the former king was almost immediately elected as King Charles XIII. The Instrument of Government of 1809 put an end to royal absolutism by dividing the legislative power between the Riksdag and the king, and vested executive power in the king when acting through the Council of State. The present Bernadotte dynasty was established in September 1810 when the Riksdag convened in Örebro, elected French Marshal and Prince of Pontecorvo Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte as Crown Prince. This took place because Charles XIII had no legitimate heir and a crown prince previously elected in January 1810, Charles August, suddenly had died of a stroke during a military exercise. Although the 19th century Bernadotte monarchs that would follow Charles XIV John's reign tried to defend the power and privileges they still had, the tide incrementally turned against personal regal rule, with the growth of the Liberals, Social Democrats, and the expansion of the franchise. When King Gustav V publicly objected to the defense budget cuts made by Prime Minister Karl Staaff and the cabinet just before the First World War in event known as the Courtyard Crisis, accompanied by the Peasant Armament Support March, it was seen as a deliberate provocation by conservatives and reactionaries against the uncodified norm of a parliamentary system supported by the Liberals and the Social Democrats, leading to Staaff's resignation. Gustav V then appointed a caretaker government, supported by the Conservatives, led by legal scholar Hjalmar Hammarskjöld, which remained in power longer than expected due to the outbreak of World War I, and increased defense spending was no longer a controversial issue. Nevertheless, in the year of the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, social tensions continued to rise. The general election in 1917 gave the Liberals and Social Democrats greatly strengthened representation in both Riksdag chambers, and a conservative government was no longer a defensible option. Following the definite breakthrough of parliamentarism in 1917, with the appointment of the coalition government of Liberals and Social Democrats led by Professor Nils Ede Acuten, the political influence of the king was considerably reduced and an unwritten constitutional precedent was set that would remain in effect until 1975. Only during World War II, in the so-called Midsummer Crisis, did Gustav V allegedly try to intervene in the political process by threatening to abdicate. King Gustav VI Adolf succeeded his elderly father, who died in 1915. 1950, and he is generally regarded as a constitutional monarch who stayed out of politics and controversy. In 1954, a royal commission began work on whether Sweden should undergo constitutional reform to adapt the 1809 instrument of government to current political realities, or whether a new one should be written. Ultimately, the latter idea was chosen. The future role of the monarchy was settled in a manner well known within Swedish political discourse. A political compromise reached at the summer resort talk-off in 1971 by representatives of 4 of the parties in the Riksdag. It mandated that the monarchy would remain largely as it was but would become entirely ceremonial, without any residual political powers left. Following the required double Riksdag votes that took place in 1973 and 1974, a new instrument of government was brought into effect. The monarch's functions and duties, as defined in the 1974 Constitution Act, include heading the special cabinet council held when there is a change of government, but no executive powers with respect to the governance of the realm are vested in him. Constitutional and official role. When, on 1 January 1975, it replaced the instrument of government of 1809 as part of the Constitution of Sweden, the instrument of government of 1974 transformed the Advisory Council of State into the collegial government, to which all executive power was transferred. Responsibility for nominating and dismissing the Prime Minister was transferred to the Speaker of the Riksdag, and the Prime Minister appoints and dismisses the other ministers at his or her discretion. Further, bills passed by the Riksdag become law without royal assent. The Prime Minister or any other cabinet minister signs them on behalf of the government, although the unwritten precedent was set in 1917, when Gustav Vasa had little choice but to support the idea of a parliamentary system and promise Prime Minister Nils Ede Akuten to stop seeking advice from secret advisers other than the duly appointed cabinet ministers and not to interfere in politics again. The talk of compromise, struck in 1971 by the 4 major parties at the time, provided, and continues to provide, a majority consensus in Swedish political discourse on the role of the monarchy within the constitutional framework. The official motive for the radical changes which came to pass in 1975 was for it to be as descriptive as possible of the workings of the state and clear on how decisions actually are made. Minister of Justice Lennart Geijer further remarked on the 1973 government bill that any continued pretensions of royal involvement in government decision-making would be of a fictitious nature and therefore highly unsatisfactory. Thus, the monarch lost all formal executive powers, becoming a ceremonial and representative figurehead. The monarch, while explicitly referred to as the head of state in the 1974 instrument of government, is not even the nominal chief executive. The instrument of government of 1974 does grant the person serving as king or queen regnant absolute immunity from criminal charges for as long as he or she remains in office. The monarch therefore cannot be prosecuted or otherwise held to account for his or her actions, both official and private, in judicial proceedings. None of the other members of the royal family of the employees the royal court enjoy similar immunity. At the request of the Speaker of the Riksdag, the monarch opens the annual session of the Riksdag in the chamber of the Riksdag building. The king or queen regnant also receives letters of credence if foreign ambassadors sent to Sweden and signs those of Swedish ambassadors sent abroad. The monarch also chairs the cabinet council in a session that which establishes the new government following a general election, a major cabinet reshuffle, and also chairs information councils approximately 4 times a year to get information from the assembled government, apart from the given by ministers in individual audiences or through other means. Formally, it is the explicit responsibility of the Prime Minister to keep the monarch informed on the affairs of the realm. The failure to do so following the 2004 tsunami disaster in the Indian Ocean gave rise to wide criticism of Prime Minister Göran Persson for his handling of the matter. The monarch also chairs the Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs, a body that enables the government of the day to inform not only the head of state, but also the Speaker and representatives of the opposition parties in the Riksdag on foreign affairs issues in a confidential manner. While the monarch is no longer the commander-in-chief of the Swedish armed forces, as he once was under the 1809 instrument of government, King Carl XVI Gustaf retains the honorary ranks of a 4-star admiral in the Swedish Navy and general in the Swedish Army and Air Force. As part of his court, the monarch has a military staff, which is headed by a senior officer and includes active duty military officers serving as aides-de-camp to the monarch and his heir family. Cultural role. The monarch and the members of royal family undertake a variety of official, unofficial and other representative duties within Sweden and abroad. The monarch and his heir family play a central role in state visits to Sweden, and the sovereign conducts state visits to other nations on behalf of Sweden. Other members of the royal family may also represent the country abroad at lesser functions. Many of the flag days in Sweden have direct royal connections. Among them are the name days of the King, the Queen, and the Crown Princess, the birthdays of the King, the Queen, and the Crown Princess, and Gustavus Adolphus Day on November 6, in memory of King Gustavus Adolphus, who was killed on that date in 1632 in the Battle of Lutzlen. None of these flag days are public holidays, however. Perhaps the most globally known ceremony in which the Swedish royals annually participate is the Nobel Prize award ceremony held at the Stockholm Concert Hall, where the monarch hands out the Nobel Prizes on behalf of the Nobel Foundation for outstanding contributions to mankind in physics, chemistry, literature, physiology and medicine, and the economic sciences. Eriksgata was the name of the traditional journey of newly elected medieval Swedish kings through important provinces to have their election confirmed by local things. The actual election took place at the Stone of Mora in Upperland, and participation was originally restricted to the people of that area, hence the need of having the election confirmed by the other parts of the realm. The Eriksgata gradually lost its importance when, as of the 14th century, representatives of other parts of Sweden began to participate in the election. After 1544, when hereditary monarchy was instituted, that meant that the Eriksgata had little practical importance. The last king to travel the Eriksgata according to the old tradition was Charles IX, whose reign began in 1604. Later kings, up until present times, have made visits to all the Swedish provinces and called them an Eriksgata, while those visits bear little resemblance to the medieval tradition.